many of you live in Austin? I'm just curious. Yes. I came here from the DC area 29 years ago, and I had to unpack a lot of what I knew before, and I'm actually a lighter and happier person because of it. I'm also curious to see how many of you are in organizations that talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay. How many, keep your hands up if you don't mind, how many of you with the hands up are actually involved in some of those initiatives? Okay. So first I want us to take a minute to thank Sauce Labs, and here's why. If you follow Brene Brown at all, and believe me, she's not the only person I'm reading, but if you're in this space, you're constantly learning, evolving, and every day is a new day to get better. You know that to show up in arenas and be vulnerable is a sign of courage. And I was just talking to Charles a minute ago about how I am a fake extrovert. I was a successful lawyer who was actually a general counsel in Washington, and it wasn't until I was about 53, I'm now almost 55, that I decided I needed to put myself in front of issues instead of running M&A and real estate and construction, which is what I was doing before. And I did that because I was at a company offsite. I'd had a lot of aha moments over time, and I'd always acted on them, and they were quite considered maverick, rebellious at the time, but I always went back behind the scenes like I normally did. But I was at a company offsite, and I didn't see a company I loved, and I didn't see any women on stage. And I didn't see any women leaders, and I didn't see enough people of color. And when you educate yourself and start to act, you never look back. It's sort of like if you become a vegetarian and you watch the movie about how chickens are raised in large farms, you just can't go back. So this isn't a comfortable space for me, but I'm trying to show by doing this that you can do this even if you're shy, and it's a sign of courage. And courage is an indicator of leadership, and we're going to talk about that a little bit too. And why I'm so excited about the fact that Sauce Labs has put this front and center is that you don't see this very often. And it's a sign of vulnerability for them to put this as a keynote, because they don't really know me that well. I know Marcus, but they don't know me that well. They don't know what I'm going to do today. And by being vulnerable themselves and putting this issue at the front and center of an important conference for them, which you can tell if you've been to a lot of industry events, there's a lot of love baked into this conference. It has a really homegrown, lots of special touches feel. That means they're being vulnerable, they're showing courage, and to me that's a sign of leadership. So I'd actually like to applaud Sauce Labs for even doing this. I'm not seeing this very much. Usually when I'm talking to executives, it's because they're afraid. So today we're going to walk through, and I've been one, so I get it. We have to meet in the middle. It's okay to make mistakes. This is the agenda we're going to walk through today. It's really text heavy, which isn't my favorite thing to do. Actually, to unpack myself from lawyering, really to unman myself, because I'd been in that space for a long time. One of the things I did for a year is I sold graphic design to big law. And you can imagine, going from being a general counsel to being a vendor to big law is probably one of the most perceived humiliating things you can do, especially in Washington when it's all about who you know, what you do. But I did that because I understood that images actually are more power than blah, blah, blah. The reason this is a text-heavy presentation is specific, it's intentional, so that you feel comfortable taking images of things that you think might resonate with you later, or you want to think about alone, or you want to talk to your colleagues or friends or family about, because I don't even operate with contracts at this point, and I don't think content needs to be so carefully held close. I think we need to share if we're going to move forward. So where we're going to start is actually what I think of as DEI 101. You may say to yourself, I already know what these words mean. Sure, you may know what you think they mean, but it's important to always ground ourselves to make sure we're using the same terminology. And before I ever start any sort of work around this in larger spaces, I always make sure we remember that it's social justice that is underlying this work. It underpins what we're doing. There are a lot of emotional underpinnings in this work. It's really important that we remember that it's important in that way too. It's not just corporate speak. I can code shift into corporate speak all day long, but that isn't what makes people follow you. As you know from Simon Sinek, it's not what you say or do, it's because they believe in what you're also talking about. So D equals diversity. These are differences that often intersect. Here are some examples of those differences. A lot of the tech industry sometimes likes to focus on cognitive differences, different perspectives and how that drives innovation. Honestly, I'd like to recenter this conversation a little more around racism, because sexism and racism are systems that we are working within, and we don't always realize it. And if we just want to use euphemisms to talk about this work, we may lose the real reason we're doing this work, and we'll see why in a minute. It's important to understand this at the outset. An example of decentering whiteness, I do a lot of community work. One of the things that's been striking me, even in really successful organizations, is that when they report their data, they report it as white and non-white. That's an example of an embedded bias, unintentional. Whiteness is not the measuring stick. It's an interesting thing to think about. Equity. Equality treats everyone the same. Equity gives everyone what they need to be successful. And a good way to think about this is, if you give everyone in the same position, with the same performance reviews, with the same amount of experience, a 1% raise, and 2 of those 4 people are people of color, it's well documented that they're not getting the same amount of money most of the time. Now, I could put my lawyer hat on for a minute and remind folks that pay gap reporting is probably going to resume. There's been a recent lift on that stay. Your EEO1 reports may have to start reporting on pay bands. But I don't find the legal stick to be particularly attractive or interesting. It's the right thing to do. And so equity is where you want to focus, giving everyone the same opportunities so that they have the same access and opportunities to succeed. And then inclusion. You hear a lot about inclusion, you read a lot about it. It's a sense of belonging, valued, welcome, connected, respected, heard. We're going to talk a little bit more about inclusion today, because inclusion is actually what drives diversity. Emotional safety matters. This is the only image I'm using in my presentation, aside from my head, which is hard to see writ large. But the reason I'm using this is because, if you are hiding your sexual orientation or your gender or your love language at work, you know that it's taking a lot of energy to do that. And right now, in front of the Supreme Court, they're trying to decide whether or not certain people can be protected under Title VII. Just recently, an organization called Broadly published the Gender Spectrum Collection. And a lot of times when you do work, you see stock photos that aren't representative of a lot of folks that want to be represented. So this is kind of a lovely way to introduce that idea. Inclusion drives diversity. If too many folks are really focused on the front end of how to attract people in, if you don't have psychological safety in your environment, you're not going to stay anyway. And here are some examples of psychological safety that may not necessarily skew to what you're thinking of for DEI work. So if you are a parent with a bipolar 1 child at home, and you know that you need to spend some time with your child to make sure that they are getting the tools and medication they need to survive, but you're known as somebody who works all the time, it's very difficult to be a caregiver and also care for someone who's ill. If you're a vet and you move into tech, and I spent 6 years, just came out of 6 years in tech. If you're a vet and you move into tech, it's well documented that one of the biggest struggles tech folks face when they're vets is the perceived sense of no hierarchy. Now, you know, if you're in tech and corporate, there's always hierarchy. I don't know why we pretend like there's not. But it's very difficult for vets to assimilate sometimes in that way. If you're hiding your gender identity at work, if you are a parent and you're so conflicted because parents aren't really celebrated at the office, if you're a diabetic and you're putting your insulin in a paper bag so it looks like a lunch bag and putting it in the lunch area when you'd really like to put it in the refrigerator where the caregiver's room or wellness room is for mothers who are nursing, this information really touches all of us in one way or another. I like to pull up this, Deloitte Consulting does a really good job in the DEI space. I like to pull up this slide sometimes because it shows the 6 signature traits of leadership. I mentioned a minute ago that showing up and being vulnerable is a sign of courage. You see courage up there. You may be embarrassed that you're asking questions or walking into something you're not comfortable with. You may have read a couple of articles, but you're afraid to say something at a meeting in the office. You see a woman being interrupted. You're not sure if you should be her ally in that moment. When you show up, even if you make mistakes, that reads as courage. That reads as courage, and it's a leadership trait, because leadership is not about your title or your position. Leadership, the signs of leadership are cognizance, curiosity, cultural intelligence, collaboration, commitment, and courage. I've been a secretary, I've been a paralegal, I've been an associate, I've been a vendor, I've been a general counsel, I've been a head of sales, I've founded things inside of large organizations, I've worked in matrixed organizations that are large, I've worked in 12-person operations. I was always the same person in all of those places. Whether or not I was a leader, and I've always had teams ever since I started working. It didn't matter. People stay with you and work with you because they believe in what you're doing. Why does DEI matter? This is interesting because if you're in an organization where you're still trying to prove the business case for DEI, then either you need to raise your hand and start talking about it a little bit more. I've proven this business case out before, and I do help companies do this. I operate as a virtual CDO sometimes. But this information is already well documented. The latest data just came out again. Gender diversity, companies with gender diversity outperformed by 21%, ethnic and cultural by 31%. To me, that's not where the conversation should be right now. We all care about customer experience, and we all care about employee experience. I work with employee experience leaders because we understand the connection between the employee experience and the customer experience. If your employee base does not recognize and does not reflect your customer base, then you're not serving your customers the way you think you are. The talent pool today, most of you know that Gen Z is, that millennials are the largest talent pool. I don't think most people know that 42% of millennials are multi-ethnic. Many of us, I've actually had teams do tests to find out what they are generationally. I'm a baby boomer who tests out as a millennial. My manager was a Gen X who tested out as a baby boomer. So I'm using these buckets for purposes of today's conversation. However, it's probable, not possible, that you may think you're sitting in an all-right room, but there's multi-ethnicity going on in that room. Your children and grandchildren are going to be involved with people who are bringing in different perspectives into your own home life. And so please be aware that 42% of the largest workforce is already there. And if you're not there yet, the turn has already occurred. By 2050, the majority will be the underrepresented group. By 2060, this is a new report by Catalyst, women of color will be the majority. I focus a lot on the intersection of racism and sexism. Not just because sexism is my lived experience, but because I think a lot of times we keep using euphemisms. Despite this data, the gaps for access, wage, leadership, skills still exist, and this becomes really relevant in this room. Social value. So millennials and post-millennials, who we know are digital natives, they look for companies to see if there's economic value and social value. They want to be doing something that provides, they want to make money, they get it. We're still living in that kind of a structure, that's fine. But they also want to be doing something that has a purpose. And Patagonia is the perfect example of a company that came out as purpose-driven, but companies are making the shift. Millennials and post-millennials and Gen X, which often gets ignored, and you probably know this, but baby boomers are typically loyal to company. Gen Xers are typically loyal to people. Millennials and post-millennials, it's a whole different ball game. They care about the issues. We probably know that. They look first at your leadership team to see how wide it is. If you have the caucasity to think you can put stock photos up on your websites and talk about how you're working in DEI, they immediately can smell that's wrong. And yes, caucasity is a word. It's not my word, but I like that word. What's the connection between what you all do and what you care about and developing work, developers? I love developers. I've worked with tech for a while. They've taught me some good lessons, including Marcus. The connection is socio-technical. What does that mean? Notice how what you're doing and what we're talking about sit at the intersection of social and economic value. The connection is, Claude did a great job talking yesterday, and I really like what Walmart's doing, by the way, in the DEI space. Claude did a great job talking yesterday about a culture of quality. In that culture of quality, you do not want to automate bias. Automation requires both human elements and non-human elements. I'm sure you've read some stuff that talks about how embedded bias in algorithms is a socio-technical problem. You would have thought this was old news, but does anyone remember when airbags were killing women and children? Oh my God, am I that old? Thank you, Marcus. Do you know that airbags were designed by and tested on men? And even short men were killed when airbags were deployed because you had to be a certain height to make it through. So I remember that starting to happen. And I remember going through the 70s, going through the second wave of feminism, and sort of being shocked by these things and thinking, well, we're in a society where that's going to get fixed. Like, that's just not right. Fast forward to 2019, and right now, one of the many things that I'm looking at all the time, and I'm sure some of you are, is bias in facial recognition software, which affects people of certain ages, genders, races, and ethnicity. What's really scary about that is that it's not just used for authentication and ID, it's also used for surveilling, and governments are using that technology and buying that technology already. And as I point out here, there is no mandatory industry-wide testing for bias and accuracy, which is kind of shocking. So there's a big gap there. What you do every day, and I get it. I've run M&A, I've run legal operations, I've run equity, meaning stock from private to public, private. I've done all the things. I did all of DEI and founded it while I was doing that job. I get it. I get time constraints, but we have to take a moment and think about what we're doing and be intentional. Are these time constraints causing me to do things in a hurry, to please leadership? Because, and we'll talk about this in a minute, they are incredibly focused on growth with a lot of pressure. Are we not thinking about these things as we do our work? Because it's going to affect our children, potentially our grandchildren, their children, the people that are your colleagues that you care about who may be covering things you don't know about. This is important. Applications need to reach a wide variety of users. First language users, old people, young people. There's a lot of reverse, I call it the silver tsunami is here, which is what I'm part of, and I do like my gray. However, there's a lot of discrimination against people who are younger, thinking they don't know enough to say or do what they say or what they say they can do. Always let your good employees do what they want. I started at 16 bucking the system and doing what I thought was better for the system. And it's hard to be at the tip of the spear. But these young folks are really fluent in the language I'm talking about right now, and they are seeing things in your organization, including especially people of color. They are seeing things in your organization that they may not be speaking about. I spend a lot of time, how many people have read Quiet by Susan Cain? That book was revelatory for me because I realized as an introvert, I had a lot of good ideas and a lot of insights and was speaking with a lot of other people who were quiet, and we were not saying anything because we didn't think leadership would listen. I had access because I was white. I had that privilege. I had an amazing education. I paid for my education. I came from a lower socioeconomic background. I had to force myself to do this because it is not the role of underrepresented groups to shoulder this burden in organizations that are large and matrixed or small and struggling. It is our responsibility to make sure that we create spaces so that people with the best ideas come forward. Developer and testing environments require human interaction. You may have colleagues around you who trust you enough to tell you about what's going on in their lives or how they're seeing that the customer persona that's largely driven by marketing and some data insight doesn't really reflect what they're seeing in their analytics. These conversations have to occur because a lot of money gets spent spinning up these ideas that this is what we're supposed to be doing. And sometimes you don't know you need to be course corrected. It's okay to be vulnerable if you're in a space where there's psychological safety. And if you haven't created that in your organization is not running as well as it can. DEI work obviously helps prevent the inadvertent exclusion of certain groups. We're going to back up for a minute. This is from the New York Times. When you have the option of just switching the people, the mission becomes more important than a cool milestone. So this is a quote from Stephanie, the NASA spokeswoman. I'm saying woman because I called her person in my slide. They kept calling her the spokeswoman. And there were a lot of things that happened when I saw this quote. So the first thing I thought when I saw this quote, are you familiar with the story? So on the space station, I think there's 6 astronauts. 2 of them are women. 2 of them were going to go out on their first spacewalk. 2 women, it was a milestone. They only had one size medium version of the shirt you have to wear for a spacewalk. So after announcing it, then they switched gears. And this was how they described why they made the switch. And the first thing, and this is where my own bias comes in, so I'm aware of it. The first thing I thought is, because I've had this before, damn, that girl is tethered to brand. What? When you have, so she's right on track with leadership right there. Well, we could have done the cool thing, but we were on a time constraint. So that felt badly for her. That was compassion. That's the first thing I thought. And the second thing I thought was, woo, this is going to be a PR/brand equity nightmare because I work a lot in brand equity too. Then she went on to say, and I'm not calling her out specifically, but this is a good example of what goes on. We're sort of getting to the point of inevitability. This encapsulates in one short sentence what too many organizations are doing. The equivocating, yeah, no, we're already in the turn. It's already happening. Everyone who's in this space, everyone who's a person of color gets it. We aren't just sort of getting the point of inevitability, we're already there. And I was concerned for NASA because we really want people in STEM to continue to aspire to these sorts of roles. And to say things like this is a ding on brand equity, and it sends the wrong message. So did any of you see that story? Raise your hand if you saw that story. Did you just take for a minute and stop and think about what that actually meant, this language? So let's talk about DEI in the tech industry. Here's what is bittersweet about this. You see all the time that there are increasing calls to make changes in the industry. I live in a town that's considered hip, and there's a lot of technology here, and I've been at construction, real estate, consumer retail, and tech, and straight up legal. I move across 3 verticals. I move across industry, which is what we're doing today, obviously, higher ed, and government. These problems exist everywhere. It gets called out more in tech. However, even in a tech town, at South by this year, we had over 200 events about this issue. Because we talk about it a lot, but we don't act, I've been spending a lot of time when I should have done lead gen, which to me, lead gen isn't a real thing because it's a relationship business. I've been spending a lot of time creating a collective of the practitioners in town because these men and women do not make enough money to not have to also have a job at Indeed or a job at Google. 52% of people doing this work inside of organizations, this is a recent study that just came out, have more than one role. And you might say, well, I've run multiple functions, what's the big deal? There's an emotional underpinning to this work. I ran a full function, as Marcus knows, and had a program of a D&I program of 365 people with the highest engagement scores. And I still, that was the landscape. So we talk a lot about it, but we're not doing a lot. What I find bittersweet isn't actually that. It's that it was the Me Too movement that really got the attention of industry. Now, those of us who know about this work know that people of color have been carrying the water, have been explaining what the hell is going on, have been talking about reparations, have been talking about taking receipts, have been talking about, I mean, I'm really involved also in the political sphere, this for a long time. And initially, Toronto Burke wasn't credited for this work. This particular piece, the Me Too movement, really resonated inside of organizations because suddenly, even though I'd already been doing the work for my whole life, really, it was all about, oh my God, the women are coming after us. The women. And yes, Me Too is an important movement, but Me Too is not the only movement. And yes, if Me Too is the thing that gets people's attention, then let's go ahead and start there. But this is not new. If you are a woman, even a woman who's not of color, and you came up in the 80s with your skirt intact and your head on straight, you're lucky. I mean, it was tough. It's still tough, it still matters, but Me Too cannot be the primary focus inside of your organization. Dismantling systemic and embedded bias is where you need to focus. Me Too is a piece of that. I really encourage you to look at the Red Thread and Mercer report on that, by the way, what's going on there. This is an important point, and as someone who's been an executive, I have deep empathy and compassion for this. This work starts at the top. Leaders need to feel comfortable. I spend more time with C-levels at lunches or breakfasts with them, just trying to help them get comfortable. They're afraid to wade in. They're not sure if they should just start at Me Too. They're not sure where to start. They're afraid to make mistakes. They have so many pressures on them already, but this work has to start at the top. I'm a huge proponent of grassroots, but I didn't do grassroots as successfully as I did, and I don't do it successfully now with other organizations unless there's leadership buy-in. It's well documented that you need it. Let's talk about the DEI Tech Market. This is really interesting because, again, Red Thread and Mercer just came out with a really interesting study about this. Look at this data. It's fragmented, growing, and large. Its market size is about 100 million as of 2018. This is their quantitative piece that just came out recently. Their qualitative piece came out last year. And most of them are small, under 4 years, and growing. I think this part, and it really resonates because I see it regularly, most DEI tech focus on hiring, so I've worked with a lot of the good enterprise solutions. But most of the reporting success talks about engagement, and by engagement here, we're talking about engagement surveys, whether your company does Pulse, annual, or one of my favorites, which is onboarding surveys, which all companies should think about doing because getting the feedback of your team members when they're new and not enmeshed in the political landscape is really critical, not just about how HR did, but how they are thinking and feeling about the company, what they understand about the vision of the company. That's really important. So a lot of executives will focus on engagement scores, which is why even in my own bio I talk about it, because executives care about that. But the vendors, and these are often millennials and now post-millennials who are creating this amazing technology, a lot of whom I work with, are focusing on hiring and haven't figured out real ways to do the work on the other end. So retention is a really important part of this. We know the turn time in tech is around 18 months. It's just really interesting to see what that market is looking like. And there are opportunities in your world to figure out how to support those markets. And if anyone ever wants to know who some of the leaders in these markets are, you'll see my information at the end. Because even though I should try to build business, I'm really just more interested and not passionate. I'm so tired of being called passionate. I'm passionate about my husband. I am skilled in this. I get it. I'm a business leader. I get it. If you want to talk to me about where to go and save some time, I'm happy to send you resources. I do it all the time. How does it affect your industry? Let's start here. DEI is a strategic growth initiative. Whether you're in a company that is using convertible debt, bootstrapping, has a seed round, is in your Series A or B, is positioning for IPO, is positioning to be acquired, all of those scenarios, the leaders are focused on growth. They're under tremendous pressure to grow their platforms, to grow in a meaningful way. Once you IPO, I don't know how many of you have been in situations where you've IPO'd and exited. Once you IPO, the pressure from the market, as if you're not a B Corp, if the pressure from the market, from your shareholders, the regulatory pressure is hard to articulate in words. If we can, you know how you make those, you know how if you meet somebody and you think, you know what, I don't think this person and I aren't gonna gel. We're just not going to. But for some reason you're stuck with them on a bus or on an elevator and you end up talking about something and you're like, well, oh wow, I think this person and I could really talk. We have some things in common, I didn't get it. Those tiny shifts in perception, when you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, are gonna be game changing because this is a strategic growth initiative. It needs to be treated like you do with any of your other growth initiatives, KPIs, everything, and we're gonna talk about that a little bit. We've already mentioned that demographics and cultural norms have shifted. If the entire marketplace, the talent pool and who you're serving is starting to shift, why wouldn't you make sure that this is one of your SGIs, that you're figuring out how to properly address it and ensure that your team members and your employee experiences are gelling? It's the same rainbow, just two different pots. I've never said that before and that sounds kind of dorky, so. Socio-technical problems matter. You are in positions to help make sure that a culture of quality includes a culture that doesn't automate bias. Bias is going to help you, if you embed bias because you're concerned about time constraints, but then you have to go back, and I'm not directly tying this to what Claude said, but this is an example of something along those lines, and revisit it and change it because the time pressure was so significant that you weren't actually able to serve both your internal customers and your external customers properly. It's gonna take you more time, cost you more money. Closing access, skills, leadership, and wage gaps matters. I noticed when I was looking at the profiles, and there's some really impressive people here, I'm really tickled to be part of this crowd, that Claude has an amazing personal initiative that he does, and he's able to speak about it, and that says to, and if you look at his bio, you'll see it. Claude, I know you're in here, I'm sorry I keep calling you out. But the reason I'm saying this is because that said to me immediately, Claude is in a space of psychological safety. I've spoken at things where Walmart's been involved and I know they're focusing on that. I came up in food retail, can you imagine, the narrowest margins ever. We were acquired by a Dutch conglomerate, Royal Ahold. There was not psychological safety. Back then, that's not what happened. We sat around and talked in leadership meetings all the time. I also was in the Royal Ahold, I also ran the Fueling for Salt Facilities project, which is bizarre. I was in New Ventures, I was a director of New Ventures. We talked all the time and using war language, war mentality, Walmart language about how we were gonna protect and, ourselves from that. And sometimes, I was the only woman in these rooms, sometimes, this was in Virginia, I would raise my hand and say, hey, I think that thing, Whole Foods, they have something going on there. Like, I'd really like to, or I'd like to go to HEB and figure out why they think fueling facilities make sense in their market. Because I was a real estate person and I realized it was a volume proposition for them because they had the dirt, they had the pads. But it's really hard to do that if you're not in places of psychological safety. So I really am impressed with organizations that have leaders who are speaking at events like this, and those leaders feel comfortable saying, and here's what else I'm doing. I'm sure there are quite a few people in here who understand that unless we help close these gaps, we're not going to be able to attract and retain the right talent. We're not going to create the impact on the world that we want to. I mean, if my skills actually lay in helping with environmental sustainability or cybersecurity or nuclear warfare, that's what I'd be doing. Wherever your highest and best skill set is right now, where you can create a change because we're in a very dark time, that's where you should put it. And if you're in an organization where you think, I think I can bring it up there, I think I can start doing that, or I'm seeing something happen, but I don't think we have the ability right now to connect all the dots, let people help you because that's why we're here. I went from a very high-paying salary to do this. I'm not doing this for the money. I'm doing it because I give a shit. How does DEI work start? Now we're going to get to some brass tacks. Identify if there's a problem. There's likely a problem in here, wherever you are. Bias is everywhere, too. I mean, I have it. We all have it. You go about it, you tackle it just like you would any other problem. If you're a problem solver, I'm a systemic thinker, it's the same thing. You look at objective and subjective information. By workplace DEI metrics and data, I'm talking about your EEO1 report, I'm talking about your engagement information, I'm talking about your onboarding surveys, I'm talking about your retention numbers, I'm talking about your looking at your bonusing for referrals. Do you have a he's like me problem? By employee perspective, a lot of that's around engagement, but also using tools that allow people who are not the types to raise their hand in meetings, like Slido and Slack and other Google-based audience tools, trying to find that are anonymous and letting people get the opportunity to raise issues that are concerning them in all hands is a really good way to get feedback that you may not be aware of. External best practices research. If you really want to learn a little bit about this work in a really quick way, I encourage you to look at projectinclude.org. That is an organization founded by Ellen Pao. Her book, Reset, she essentially started the conversation in the Silicon Valley, is about to be made into a movie. Industry comparison is subjective because it's your distillation of what you see in that industry comparison. Then don't forget, you have to talk to the stakeholders, and the stakeholders have to get comfortable. I presented a business case for this work in my last role. I help executives and I help middle managers particularly do this now. You have to create a cogent and thoughtful business case about why you're doing this. And in that business case, you need to make sure you're asking for resources, and that includes access to data, access to capital, human and financial. Raising awareness, so it's pretty easy. A lot of times people will say, well, we don't want to talk about the fact that in the C-suite we're talking about this. And honestly, the best thing to do, you don't have to have everything perfect. Those of us, women in particular, I know I've had this, who've struggled with body image issues or thinking they had to be perfect to succeed, particularly women, because we have to prove it again and again and again. This does not have to be perfect. You can start talking about it even before you think you're ready, because letting your team members know that this is something your company is thinking about and we're going to invite you into the conversation lets some of the air pressure out of the tire. And you may think there's no pressure in that tire, but it's there. It's there. Most of the young people are moving into their own companies for a reason. Implement transparent metrics and survey results. Now, if I put my lawyer hat on for a minute, I do not recommend reporting your internal metrics around diversity externally unless you're a large enough organization that 5 people of color leaving isn't going to move the dial that significantly. But nobody's stupid. They look around their organization and they see if there's no one like them. If you don't have enough black and brown people, if you have a bamboo ceiling, if you see Asian leaders stopping at a certain point, if you see no black women in leadership, if you see no women in leadership outside the typical roles like legal, marketing, and HR, and by the way, HR and DEI work, we're frenemies. Candy Castleberry-Singleton at Twitter has said this before, and it's true. We understand that you are working in resource and time constraints and don't always recognize that your own systems are part of the problem. So implementing transparent metrics and survey results, establishing accountability and clear communication channels, whether those are anonymous or not. And this is really important. Any of you who are doing this work in your organization, no doubt, are doing it on a volunteer basis. You need to set folks up who are doing this work for success, and you need to recognize them. Recognition can come in the form of cash, equity, time off, flex schedule, awards, whatever it is. There may be one DEI leader, but everyone is responsible. Is anyone familiar with Culture Amp? Okay, Culture Amp does a really good job with engagement surveys, including DEI questions. They have 5 open source free questions that you can get, and I'm happy to share those with you too. They do something I've not seen before that I really like, particularly given how beleaguered I know this can be, what this feels like. They rotate the DEI lead throughout their organization, and that's really cool because everyone is responsible. And once you do that role, you really get what it takes to do that role, and you do the best you can, and then you pass it on. And I think that's a really nice model to think about. How are the efforts measured? It's just like any business initiative. That how you look at metrics depends on the type of metrics. If you're looking at engagement surveys, it's ranked metrics. Putting this into the regular business planning process is a good way to get everyone's attention, focus the issues, make sure your reporting is making sense. If you're in an organization where you try to do this when you're leading the effort and there's resistance, that's a red flag. This work is dynamic. It's just like if you're doing a product, it's just like design thinking. It's iterative. You change. You don't get locked into one plan. You don't let a PR approach to it. You don't let yourself be co-opted by brand in ways that don't make sense. You try to attach the actual conversation of your team members to the issues. If you have time, try to look at Retail Me Not's D&I video that we did. It's on the website. We used our own people to talk about what this was like for them, because we were tired of seeing these kind of pictures in rooms where a white person and a brown person were looking at a laptop. Like, we wanted it to be real because it was real. So make sure that you take the advice, just like legal advice. I do this now. I take the advice, but then I make the decision based on, I take informed detachment is a good way to operate here. So don't assume that the team that seems to be in charge of it or that's counseling you is definitely right, because they're coming with their own reasons for that particular issue. So be open to adjusting. And then it's really a good idea when you're thinking about how do you measure this work to think about it in these 3 buckets. I'm gonna come over here just to see what this is like. Attracting, developing, and retaining. Like I mentioned earlier, too much of the DEI tech right now is in the attracting and hiring bucket. Too much of the reporting that people are using in their companies is in the retaining bucket. So there are lots of systems that are already in your company that you can use to start reporting on this work. And how you customize it is specific to your company. There's no silver bullet. And there are lots of easy, simple changes you can make. So you may think that your HRIS or your applicant tracking system there's no bias in there, but the job description that you fed into it, it could be a problem. Your boilerplate, EEO data boilerplate, turns people off. If you don't have salary negotiable in your job descriptions, women are less likely to negotiate for salary. If you don't have engagement surveys at all, if you don't know the net promoter score on your own people, it's likely you don't know what's going on. If you have a founder or a CEO who's the only one who controls that data and information and you don't see any meaningful outcomes from it, then what's the point of the engagement survey? If you think your engagement survey is anonymous, ask the questions to make sure that it is, because I've been on all sides of these issues and you'd be surprised. Promotion data is when I say that, one of the nice things to look at, not just in your succession planning, but is what is our rate on organic growth? How often are we promoting people inside the company? And are we making sure that we know from studies, you probably have seen them too, 2 of the main reasons people leave companies is they don't like their managers, they can't take it. The biggest obstacle you usually have when you're running these programs inside or initiatives inside companies are the middle managers. Middle managers who go from independent contributor to manager and who aren't on board are either neutral or they're against you. It takes a lot of energy to be neutral, and if they're against you, you definitely know it. So making sure that you're really focused on getting your middle managers in the swim is a good idea. Okay, let's go through the key takeaways. Again, it's an SGI. Please think about it that way. Let that marinate for a while and start to see why that makes sense. It instills top-down accountability and transparency if you have a good approach. You redress systemic, including socio-technical and individual bias. How cool to get awarded inside your company for noticing that what you've been automating or what you've been doing on exploratory testing or how you've been developing code had some bias in it you didn't realize. It sets folks up for success. The people who are doing this work, it's hard work. They're doing it because they care. If they're doing it in your organization, they're really trying to make a difference. And it serves the team members, your customers, and your community. We all know Richard Branson likes to say, take care of your team members first. Your team members are your biggest asset. It's true. I get the pressure for growth, but if you're focusing on all three here and serving your community at the same time, the feeling that you get is transportive. So that's all the time I have today. See, again, I forget to slide. I don't like to see my head, but this is how you can find me. I'm very active on Twitter and LinkedIn, not because I like to talk about myself, but because I think this conversation, using a marketing term, has to have constant relevance. I'm very active in the Austin community. I talk about how we're addressing racism, particularly here. The city plan of 1928 is what created the racist problems we have here, race and class problems that we're working through. We're very candid about it. So please, if you want to talk, if you want more information, reach out, because I love connecting, and I'm really tickled that this is part of this really home-feeling conference. So thank you very much.